Hey, this is Antonio. Welcome back to my channel. Know who's ready for some fighting words. In this video, I want to do a fight breakdown for Terence "Bud" Crawford facing David Avanesyan. And really short, really quick. If you like the videos, please like, please share, please subscribe to the channel. Let's jump into it. So first and foremost, when you think about Bud, you just think about a high caliber fighter, a championship caliber fighter. And he's always been that way. It's not as if he's coming into something in the second half of his career or something like that. He's literally come in like that. He came in hot and he's still blazing hot. One thing Bud can do that a lot of fighters can't do, and I think this is kind of what separates the greats from the okays. Bud can dissect a fighter. He can dissect a guy while in a fight with a guy. A lot like Floyd Mayweather. You know, Floyd Mayweather can kind of pick and see what you're great at and what you're not great at, and he's going to basically take those attributes from you, and then he's going to implement his own game plan as well. And Bud does exactly the same. Bud's a very calculated fighter. Bud's a very smart fighter. Bud's a very paced fighter. But he knows how to break a guy down. He also looks at his weaknesses. He looks at what he's strong at, and he's basically in the opening rounds, I'll probably say the first two rounds, he's just computing everything. He's seeing how you move. You know, once you throw the jab, are you going to step off, or what are you going to do? What are your feints? He's computing all that so that he can decide, all right, my initial game plan versus you, I might keep that, but then again, I might throw that away, or I might just break that in half. And then he'll make his game plan basically on the fly. And again, I feel only the greats can do that. Only the greats can do that. You know, Roy Jones had a way of meshing with an opponent. Bernard Hopkins, I know a lot of people would say they don't necessarily like the way that he fought, or sometimes it could be a little bit sloppy, but he had a way of just meshing with the fighters that he was fighting. And it kind of just turned into him using their weaknesses against them. James Toney, I think, is a perfect example of just taking away what you do best and drawing you into something and then having you fight his fight. Like I said, Bud is a really calculated puncher. He's not gonna He's not gonna throw a lot of punches. He's just not gonna do that unless he sees that you're hurt. If Bud sees that you're hurt, he's definitely gonna throw a lot of punches. If he does not see that you're hurt, he's not gonna waste the energy. He's certainly not gonna waste the time, and he can actually use that energy in better ways. For example, like a setup. He can use that for a setup and get you to a place that would best suit him to launch an attack on you. Bud can fight in the pocket. I think Bud is really strong in the clinch. I think, I'm not going to necessarily say they're 50-50. I would probably say they're 60-40. But Bud Crawford is extremely strong in the clinch. He's extremely effective and dangerous up close and personal. But I do feel like he likes to fight at a distance, mainly because of the pacing. And also because he likes to see what his opponents are going to do. And it's better for him to control a fighter it's easier sometimes to control a fighter if you have distance. Now, again, I think Bud Crawford is a phenomenal wrestler, so it's not as if he can't control you up close and personal. But I think when you have a guy who's computing that much information in the fight, I think it's still safer for him to be at a little bit of a distance. Let's see. Bud, and again, let me just say this. Like I said, he likes to fight from a distance, but he's just a sniper. I think he's a guy who's really comfortable in the clinch, but at heart, he's a sniper, and he would like to snipe you from far out. He would like to hit you and be able to get out of there after he hits you. You know, he has this kind of jerk reaction, like he'll hit and he'll jerk. And that jerk is more or less, if that hit doesn't hurt, I'm ready to, get out of here and then relaunch another attack. But you can't really do that if you're in a clinch. So again, I do think he fights extremely well in a clinch. I think he's a phenomenal wrestler in his clinch work. And if he's on the ropes or in a corner, he knows how to dictate that situation best and get out of that situation. But I think at his core, I think he's the guy who would prefer to have a little space between him and his opponent. Bud does throw combinations, but for the most part, he'll use simple attacks until it's basically he's closing the curtain on you and it's the final blows. Then he'll really unload. He'll let his hands go. I think Bud sometimes has a tendency. He can get a little sloppy every once in a while, like if you were to get him in a firefight, which is another reason why I do think it's safest and best for him to fight at a distance. What is Bud good at? Setting traps for opponents. Even though Bud moved up in weight, like I said, he's extremely strong. Bud Crawford is deceptionally strong. And I think a lot of his opponents have viewed him like, well, he's coming from 140, although he's been there for a few years now. But still, you came initially from a smaller weight class. So once the smaller guy, always the smaller guy. But he's deceptionally strong. And again, very controlling and in the know when he's in a clinch. He's not a guy you're going to get him in a corner and Bud's going to go, oh no, he's bigger and stronger than me. He's a true welterweight. He's not going to do that. He's actually really strong in the clinch. He has a lot of strength. Believe it or not, Bud can deadlift a lot of weight. So I think those are some things that he's good at. Bud is also a stalker, and he uses subtle pressing. So he will launch an attack. Bud has a lightning fast jab, but he will launch an attack. But he doesn't cut off the ring like say somebody like a Triple G. He doesn't cut off the ring like that. Bud is very subtle in a lot of the things that he does. And I think a lot of the reason for a lot of his success is the fact that guys don't even know they're in trouble until they're in trouble. It's not like Triple G where, like he's on you and he's pressing this attack, or, Canelo or Jermell Charlo, where you kind of know when you're in trouble. But Bud, it's like you kind of wake up like, I was just throwing some punches at this guy, or I felt like I had the last round and now I'm in trouble. That's kind of how Bud is. He's very subtle. When he's cutting off the ring, he's very subtle with setting traps. It doesn't even feel like you're in a trap. It doesn't feel like he's stepping on the gas because he's still moving at a certain pace. So it doesn't necessarily feel like he's stepping on the gas. And then you find yourself, how to get up against these ropes. You find yourself, why am I in a corner? You find yourself, why am I getting swollen? Why am I bleeding? And he's very subtle, very, very subtle. And I think that a large reason of that is the pace. I think another reason for that is the volume isn't so high. So it's like, well, if I'm keeping up with you, I don't see how you're winning this race right now. But he's very subtle in his pressing. He's very subtle in his attacks. And before you know it, you're under attack. Like I said, Bud is not going to jump into anything. He will gradually cut off the ring. And again, that just goes back to, like I said, with those subtle attacks. You'll find yourself pressed back. Bud is a solid body puncher, but he's not a relentless body puncher. He's more or less the guy who will probably finish off a combination with a body attack or something like that. Or he'll probably just try something else. He's not like a relentless pursuer of, punching the ribs. He's not that. He's not like Earl Spence, who's just going to I'm going to beat you up downstairs until you just collapse, like a lung collapses or something like that. He's not going to do that. I do think he is a great body puncher. I mean, he has dropped guys with one punch to the body. So I think he is a phenomenal body puncher. But I think the main thing with Bud is mixing things up. And I also think that it's his ability to keep everything fresh and you not knowing what's going to come next, round after round after round. If a lot of people would see that, or probably say that, granted this video is for David Avanesyan, when we're talking about Bud versus Earl Spence, I think that one of the strengths for Bud, or a strong candidate for why I think Bud could beat Earl Spence, is the fact that Earl Spence won't know what Bud's doing from round after round, while Bud will know what Earl is going to do from round after round. And I think that is a tactical advantage. if you know what the guy's going to do and you don't know what he's going to do, you don't know. I mean, he might have put 3 rounds of body work in. Now he's going straight upstairs and he's just throwing check hooks or something like that. Whatever the case may be, now he wants to wrestle. Whatever the case may be, you don't know what he's going to do. Maybe he'll just go back to a simple jab. You don't know. So I think that there's a lot of ways to frustrate guys. And I look at a guy like David Avanesyan, and quite frankly, I see a guy who's built and made for Terence Bud Crawford to look good against. You're talking about a guy who's heavy-handed. You're talking about a guy who's going to only come forward. You're talking about a guy who will throw a lot of punches, but Bud is a great counterpuncher. I just, he's a muscle dude. Another thing about David Avanesyan is he doesn't necessarily do much in a clinch. And I feel like that's going to be a huge deficit for him because you're dealing with Bud Crawford. I mean, his sons are championship wrestlers. Like they're state champions. So you're dealing with that guy and you don't do well in a clinch. When I see David Avanesyan in a clinch, he normally just raises his hands and basically is pleading for the referee to step in and do something. And a guy like Bud Crawford is going to take full advantage of that. And trust me, the first time he sees the crack in that armor, he knows what he's going to do with you. And that's going to be a real bad moment for David Avanesyan. Let's see. A great tactic that Bud likes to use is a straight to the body. And it's very similar to Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather used it a lot during his career. It's really effective, especially with bigger guys. There's a few things it does. One is it just kind of, and it'll like sap the wind out of you. And it's just, you just kind of have that kind of emotion. 2, it's going to stop you in your tracks. And then 3, because of that just kind of stopping you in your tracks and seeping the air out of you, you got to start all over, And so that's 3 components in terms of benefits for that punch. And it is a very effective punch. It's a dangerous punch because you do have to get into a line of fire. But, if you are defensively minded like Bud Crawford is, and you're fast, well, then, you don't necessarily have to worry about too much. Not to mention, I do think Bud Crawford is faster than David Avanesyan. So, again, you don't necessarily have to worry about too much. And, again, you got David Avanesyan. We know he's going to come straight forward. Like, it's just who he is. He's like that. So, it's not like he's going to be hard for Bud to find. Here's the thing. David Avanesyan sometimes likes to use a high guard, and that can serve him. See, here's the thing with it. Let me just start like this. Here's the thing with a high guard. It can serve you. Do I think it will serve you for 12 rounds? No, a high guard is not going to serve you for 12 rounds. It can serve you, but you can't come in from round 1 and then try to, just walk people down doing a high guard for 12 straight rounds. That's not going to serve anybody consistently. Now, that being said, David Avanesyan likes to use that high guard, and I don't necessarily think that's going to serve him very well over the rounds. I think that's going to open him up to the body from Bud Crawford. I think that's going to open him up to Bud angling off. I think that's going to open him up to getting tied up by Bud. I just think that's going to open him up to a lot of things. And again, as you know, I really do respect David Avanesyan. He's no walk in the park by any means. And he is, by every means, a tough opponent. But, in terms of skill set, there's clearly, a difference between him and Terence Bud Crawford, which we will see. I'm trying to see what I want to talk about next. Here's the thing. Styles make fights. I think when you look at a guy like David Avanesyan, he is a very emotionally charged fighter. Nothing wrong with that. But I think when you have a guy like Terence Bud Crawford, he can definitely use your aggression and anger against you. And we've seen him do that. We've seen him with Sean Porter. We've seen him with Jeff Horn. You had two guys who, at least, with Sean is a bigger guy. He's a big guy. At least when he's a big guy. He's not the tallest guy, but he's a big guy. Jeff Horn's actually a pretty big guy. Two wild guys too. Like I'll say it like that. Two wild guys. And Bud did kind of short work with both of them. Kind of toyed with them, And when I look at guys who are really aggressive, that's not going to serve David Avanesyan the way I think he thinks it will. I think the best thing for David Avanesyan is to literally just go in there and let your hands go. But don't be wild and reckless. But let your hands go. I think he needs to set a pace. Don't let Bud set the pace. But Bud knows how to keep the distance, so it's going to be really difficult to try to make Bud follow your pace. So, and it's an interesting fight. And I think another component of this fight is Bud was hoping to get the Errol Spence fight. Why is the Errol Spence fight important? Because I think Bud was already training / mentally being prepared for a very come forward, aggressive guy. A big, strong, aggressive guy that's just going to keep pressing the action forward. So when you get David Avanesyan, who's not as gifted and talented as Errol Spence Jr., if I've already been training for this type of fighter, and now I'm getting this type of fighter on a lower caliber, I can see how Bud can make short work of David Avanesyan just because of that. Because he already had Errol Spence in mind. Errol Spence is a pressure fighter. Well, you're still getting a pressure fighter, but you're not going to get a pressure fighter who thinks like Errol Spence. You're not going to get a pressure fighter who's as fast as Errol Spence. You're not going to get a pressure fighter who's as tall and has long arms like Errol Spence. You're getting David Avanesyan. So great. I think it's going to work well and play well into Bud's hands. Here's the thing when it comes to Bud, and it's hard to really, I don't want to say it's really kind of hard to make a game plan for Bud, only for the fact, or the simple fact, that Bud is never the same fighter twice. He's not going to be the same fighter twice. He's never going to be the same fighter twice. So whatever you saw with him and Sean Porter, don't expect to see that with him and Kell Brook. Whatever you saw with him and whoever, he's not going to be the same guy consistently, because he's changing himself based on the opponent. A lot of guys say the same, and they're just going to be the same version of themselves. But hopefully, since it's another fight, a better version of myself. Bud is going to be like, well, I'm going to be this version of Bud, because this version of Bud beats that opponent easily. And again, it's just hard to train for a guy like that. Listen, David Avanesyan does hit hard, but here's the thing with hitting hard. I think guys who hit hard, it's kind of like a mental thing. Like, oh, I hit hard. You look at a Deontay Wilder. Now, he's not typically, I think he's always the smaller guy in the ring. I don't think he's ever been bigger than any of his opponents. But he has this mental thing, well, I hit hard. Worst case scenario, and you guys have heard me say this before, worst case scenario, I hit hard. And I think David Avanesyan is going in thinking the same thing. Yeah, I have said in the past that Bud's chin is questionable, and I think it is questionable. But I also think every time that Bud's chin has been questionable, Bud put himself in a predicament that he didn't have to put himself into. So as a result, he got tapped. So yes, David Avanesyan does hit hard, but Bud hits hard as well. But also, Bud's a very defensive-minded fighter. And I do think he can take a punch. I mean, I do think he can take a punch. I just think if I'm wrong, please go back and let's look at the tape together. I think every time that he's been in a questionable situation, it's because he was doing something questionable or found himself in a questionable circumstance that led to that questionable situation. That's what I think about that. I think power might be equal between Bud and David Avanesyan, to be honest with you. Because, yeah, I think David Avanesyan might be the more heavy-handed fighter of the two, but I think Bud is a much more crisp fighter of the two. And I'd rather be a crisp puncher than a heavy puncher, because if you're crisp, you can hit the target. And if you can hit the target spot on, then 9 times out of 10, you should be able to knock the target out. So that's that. I think Bud is going to be a little bit too much of a puzzle for David Avanesyan. I think he's a great fighter. I really do. I think he's a solid fighter. But I think there's too many levels for David Avanesyan and Terence Bud Crawford. It's going to be an entertaining fight. I will definitely say that. You're talking about two finishers. You're talking about two guys who don't like leaving anything in the judge's hands. So overall, I do think it's going to be a very entertaining fight. I did give this fight a little slack early on, like, why didn't you try to fight, Keith Thurman or something like that? But after looking at a few of David Avanesyan's fights, you know what? I think it's going to be a really good fight. And I think this fight is actually kind of perfect to set up something with Errol Spence, just meaning giving Bud, just some rounds with a really heavy-handed, aggressive guy that's going to come forward. That's what I mean by that. Overall, I do have Bud Crawford winning. I think Bud is more calculated. I think Bud is just as powerful. I think Bud is much, much stronger and intelligent in the clinch than David Avanesyan. I think David Avanesyan's aggression will work against him versus Terence Bud Crawford. And like I said, I just look at the clinch work. I look at the selection of punches that Terence Bud Crawford has versus David Avanesyan, and I just don't see how David Avanesyan kind of gets through this test of Terence Bud Crawford. But overall, that was my fight breakdown for Terence Bud Crawford versus David Avanesyan, and I hope you liked. Please share. Please subscribe to my channel.